documents ever written. It helped protect millions of people from abuse, oppression, and state power. But there's a flaw in it. Not an obvious one, not the one people argue about. It's a flaw that only becomes visible when the world changes. And it's one that's now being quietly exploited in ways the convention was never designed to stop. This isn't about tearing human rights down, it's about understanding what they missed. Because if we don't, democracy doesn't break loudly, it breaks silently. To understand the European Convention on Human Rights, we have to go back to where modern human rights began. So in 1948, just 3 years after the end of the Second World War, the world was trying to process the scale of what just happened. Genocide, total war, industrialized killing, entire populations stripped of rights, dignity, and even identity. The lesson was painfully clear. If governments are left unchecked, they can destroy human rights dignity on a massive scale. So for the first time in history, nations came together and agreed on something radical. That every human being has inherent dignity and that governments exist to serve people, not the other way round. This became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, not a law yet, but a statement of values. But values alone aren't enough. To protect people, those values had to be turned into rules. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights set out a vision, but it wasn't legally binding. So European nations took the next step. In 1950, they created the European Convention on Human Rights. This wasn't a statement of hope, it was a rule book, a set of legal obligations that governments agreed to follow. And its purpose was simple, to stop governments from ever again abusing their power in ways that destroy human dignity. This is crucial. The ECHR was written for governments, not for citizens, not for company, and not for the media. It tells the state that what it must not do to its people. And to understand why it was written this way, we need to look at the world Europe was living in at the time. It's important to be clear about the European Convention on Human Rights actually is. The ECHR isn't a guide for good government, it's not a blueprint for a healthy democracy, and it's not a promise that citizens will be well informed. It's essentially a legal backstop. A set of rules that governments are not allowed to break when dealing with their own people. Think of it less as how a state should care for its citizens and more as how a state must not harm them. The focus is restraint, limits, red lines. That made perfect sense in the 1940s because the greatest threat to human dignity was obvious, visible, and brutal: the state itself. It was shaped around one overriding question: how do we stop another Hitler or another Stalin? There's something important. There's something important the original human rights frameworks understood instinctively, even if they never fully wrote it down. Power doesn't begin with violence, it begins with stories. Long before people are arrested, censored, or oppressed, something else happens first. They're persuaded, misled, distracted, divided. Each totalitarian system, fascist or communist, allows the same pattern. First, control the flow of information, then shape what people believe, then justify what comes next. That's why authoritarian regimes don't just seize parliaments or courts, they seize newspapers, radio stations, broadcasters, and now social media platforms. Because if you control the story, you don't need to control the people directly. They'll police themselves. And this is where the ECHR's original assumptions start to matter. At the heart of the ECHR is a powerful assumption that if people are free to speak, free to publish, and free to debate, then truth will naturally rise to the top. This idea shaped everything: protect speech, and democracy will protect itself. And in the 1950s, that assumption made sense. Information travelled slowly, media was regulated, journalism followed shared standards, lies were easier to challenge, and the state was the only actor powerful enough to manipulate millions of people at once. The problem isn't that the ECHR failed. The problem is that the world changed and the convention didn't. Power no longer flows from governments or only flows from governments. Today, power flows through platforms, through algorithms, through data, through attention. Information no longer moves slowly, it moves instantly. It no longer comes from a handful of regulated broadcasts. It comes from millions of accounts, some human, some automated, some foreign, some deliberately deceptive. The ECHR was built to stop a government silencing the truth. It was never designed to stop the truth from being drowned. This gap didn't stay theoretical for long. Once information stopped being regulated by scarcity, once attention became a commodity, once speech could be amplified without accountability, a new kind of weapon emerged. Not censorship, not repression, but influence. If you can't silence people, you don't need to. You just need to confuse them. And crucially, this weapon doesn't violate the ECHR. It passes straight through it. And this isn't theory and it isn't speculation. These are the mainstream investigations, government statements, and platform disclosures. Reuters reports Germany summoning the Russian ambassador over what it calls a surge in hybrid attacks, including coordinated disinformation campaigns. Investigators have exposed organized Russian operators like Doppelganger, networks that clone real news websites to push false stories across Europe and the United States. Other investigations uncovered groups impersonating journalists, using fake bylines, fake outlets, and AI-generated content to erode trust in media itself. And more recently, platform transparency tools revealed that some high-profile political accounts presenting themselves as grassroots voices were actually operating from outside the countries they claim to represent. Not silenced, not censored, simply amplified. None of this requires breaking human rights law. It doesn't rely on repression. It exploits something far more powerful, an information system that protects free speech, but does not protect the truth. And this is where the paradox begins. Here's where things get deeply uncomfortable. The European Convention on Human Rights was designed to protect free speech from the state, and that protection is essential. But the law protects speech itself, not the intent behind it. So when speech is used honestly, it's protected. And when speech is used dishonestly, to mislead, manipulate, or destabilize, it's still protected. Because legally, it looks the same. The Convention doesn't recognize a right to truthful information. It doesn't recognize large-scale manipulation as a democratic arm, and it doesn't clearly define the principles democracy depends on. So the very shield designed to protect democracy ends up shielding the weapon being used against it. And this wasn't a mistake, it was a blind spot. So when you strip everything back, what's the actual problem? It's this. Democracy depends on people being able to agree on basic reality, on what's true, what's false, and what can be trusted. But our human rights framework doesn't protect that, it protects speech. That gap didn't matter when lies were rare, slow, and easy to challenge. But in the world of mass manipulation, algorithm amplification, and foreign influence, that gap is enough to break the system. This isn't a fringe idea. Legal scholars have warned for years that democracy depends on informed citizens, but our human rights laws never caught up. And the important thing is, this doesn't mean the system is broken beyond repair. So what happens next? The first thing to say is the European Convention of Human Rights is not static. It was never meant to be. It's a living framework, one that has already been amended as society has changed. Nothing about recognising the importance of truth means abandoning free speech, and nothing about protecting democracy means giving governments the power to decide what people are allowed to think. What it does mean is acknowledging a new kind of harm. Large-scale manipulation, coordinated deception, information warfare that undermines democratic choice without ever breaking existing law. Updating the system doesn't mean weakening it. It means making it fit for the world that we actually live in. None of this works without public pressure. Rights don't protect themselves. Democracy doesn't maintain itself. If we want honesty in public life, if we want media that informs instead of manipulates, if we want to rebuild trust, then we have to demand it. Truth Matters exists to bring people together around one simple idea. We can't fix anything until we agree on what's real. If you agree, please join the movement, follow, share, spread it, because defending truth is how we defend our future. Thank you for your time.